Thanks very much, Freya. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always nice to go to a conference where I can take a tram rather than a plane. When we talk about the malaria map of the world, this is the map from the 19th century, and you can see there's very few countries where there wasn't at least some malaria transmission over that period. Now, over the 20th century, we did manage to shrink the malaria map a lot, so that malaria disappeared from North America, most of Europe, and quite a lot of the Near East, and the map shrank somewhat in South America and elsewhere. So we have made progress over the last couple of hundred years with a number of relatively simple approaches. But we still have a number of important questions when we think about actually eliminating malaria. So why are we trying to do it? What would be the benefits? Who is actually supporting these initiatives? And how much progress have we made so far? And so, as Freya said, really nobody was thinking much about the possibility of eliminating or eradicating malaria until the forum that the Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates, held in 2007. And really, the fact that we have the potential to eliminate malaria, and we know the importance of malaria as a cause of not only health problems but social inequity, really means that it's something that we should do if we can possibly do it. A comment from Warren Buffett below, who's also donated a large amount of his money, nearly $3 million in the last year, towards programs such as malaria elimination, below there. So what would be the benefits? And apart from the direct health benefits, as I say, there are enormous economic benefits. So malaria in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, over 40 years, had a very major, something like 60% drag on GDP in highly endemic countries. Something like $2 trillion of benefits globally from eliminating malaria over a decade, and apart from all the direct healthcare costs of malaria as a disease. So who's going to help support the elimination? And firstly, I think that the main thing is that we need good strategies to eliminate malaria, which have been developed under the auspices of the World Health Organization. And I've shown three particularly important ones there. The strategic, I can't read the slides here, from strategic global technical strategy, which is really a global document about both countries that are trying to improve malaria control, countries approaching elimination, and countries that are actually getting into the elimination phase. And the middle one is a guide for actual what you need to do to get to malaria elimination. And the third one deals with the very pressing problem of malaria in the Mekong region, which is where drug resistance, which you'll be hearing more about during this session, is particularly a serious problem. So who's going to be supporting this? Well, apart from the countries themselves, for the economic benefits it will bring, there will need to be outside support. WHO is really an advocacy and policy organisation, but organisations such as the Global Fund for HIV, TB and Malaria have distributed large amounts of money, and hopefully will continue to be able to do so towards programs related to malaria treatment, but also to malaria elimination. The President's Malaria Initiative, which has been a very successful bipartisan program through USAID, supporting the Mekong Initiative. Hopefully that will not be too severely cut by changes to the State Department budget in the US. The Australian government has been a major supporter of a couple of initiatives that I'll talk about in a moment. And then private organisations such as the Gates Foundation. And obviously there are many other international donors as well, but these are just some of the examples. We also, I think I missed a slide here. Okay, maybe not. also have political will, and the Asia-Pacific Leaders Malaria Alliance, which was founded a few years ago, it now includes all of the countries in the Asia-Pacific where malaria is currently transmitted, who've all committed over the next 13 years to goals of eliminating malaria. And you can see with the different flags there who's the different timelines for elimination. So there's political will from the highest levels of government to do this. What progress have we been making so far? So this is some of the results from Central and South America, showing that even in the last decade or so of the 20th century, quite big strides could be made by improving health systems, developing economies in countries such as Nicaragua, Brazil, Peru. So what have we managed to do in our part of the world? Well, these are some data from the malaria endemic countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Not very easy to work out who's who, but this is a log scale of numbers of cases, and you can see there have been some very dramatic decreases in numbers of cases, such as Sri Lanka, which actually has now been declared to have malaria elimination, and Bhutan, which is getting very close and I think has a goal for either this year or next year of malaria elimination. Some other countries, such as Indonesia, still have very high burdens of cases in a very large population, but the number of deaths even in those countries has fallen dramatically over the last decade. So this is the current status of the world in terms of whether malaria is still being transmitted, whether there's undertakings to eliminate malaria, and whether malaria is still in the control phase. And you can see that there are a large number of countries in blue which have made commitments to malaria elimination over the next up to 15 years, some of them with earlier timeframes than that for elimination. There's a list of the countries that Freya mentioned in her introduction that have eliminated malaria over the first 15 years of this century. Now, there are a number of technical challenges when we think about malaria elimination, and I won't spend a lot of time talking about this because I guess this is not specifically a malaria audience, but we do have a very large number of people living in the countries where malaria is still transmitted, including in areas, specific areas within those countries where transmission is common, something of the estimate of over 2 billion people. We'll be hearing from Julie and James in particular about need for new vaccines to control malaria and for better drugs to combat the challenges we're facing with drug resistance. We also have specific challenges with Vivax malaria, where the drug we want to use to eliminate Vivax and stop it causing relapses, Primaquine, is very prone to cause hemolysis in people who have glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency, which is a very common genetic abnormality in this part of the world, and we need better point-of-care tests for this deficiency. And we need to work out if we're going to be giving mass drug administration to populations, how we're going to do that, how we're going to get populations to buy in to these kind of campaigns. So this shows what happens if we start trying to eliminate a disease like malaria or control it, and then we stop doing it. And this is experience from Sri Lanka, where after the Second World War there was a very intensive campaign of insecticide spraying and drug administration and so on, which brought cases down from high levels down to single figures, actually. And then as malaria disappeared, the campaign was wound back and stopped, and malaria was resurgent with a vengeance, to the point that by the 1980s, as you can see in the top right, there were very high numbers of cases. Many deaths occurred during that resurgence because people had lost their natural immunity to the disease. Now, Sri Lanka has regrouped, has reduced malaria dramatically, and as I said, last year was declared to be malaria-free. So we don't want to have to go through that process again. Some of the other challenges include contiguous countries where there are cross-border issues. One particular one is in the Korean Peninsula, where most of the malaria in South Korea is actually found very close to the demilitarized zone, the border with North Korea, because of the difficulties with infrastructure and access in that area. But in other countries as well, there may be frequent people movements which are bringing in parasites and people from countries where malaria is not well controlled into places that are controlled. So having good systems in place to mop those up, to detect people bringing parasites into the country, to treat them, is something we're going to need to develop to a much greater extent. We also have the challenge of drug resistance, and you'll be hearing more about that and probably seeing some of these same figures over the rest of the session. But all of the malaria drugs we've used since the Second World War have developed resistance, and mostly it's arisen in our region in Southeast Asia, such as chloroquine resistance, which arose in Thailand in 1957. And in the chart on the right, this shows the prevalence of mutations which are associated with decreased efficacy of the artemisinin drugs, which are the global mainstay for malaria treatment. So this poses a major challenge for malaria, not only in our region but elsewhere. Fortunately, to date, clinically relevant resistance has not been reported in Africa, although with global movements of people, it's very likely that parasites will be transferred into those countries, which would be a major disaster. So is malaria elimination achievable in our region? I think there's a few issues to consider. Firstly, in the European and American regions, I think a lot of the decrease in malaria was linked to economic development, improving housing, draining swamps, which were a major region where malaria parasites were breeding in countries like Italy, for example, and so on. And so if economic development continues in the countries in this region, I think we will have a good chance of making major strides towards malaria elimination. We have no guarantees that funding will continue to be coming from major donors towards these campaigns. The Australian aid budget is frequently seen as a soft target when it comes to the annual federal budget, which is due in in about a month's time. And similarly, as I mentioned, the State Department in the US is under tremendous pressure budgetarily. So whether that's funding going directly to programs or going through organisations such as the Global Fund, it may be very difficult to make up that shortfall in funding. I mentioned that Vivax has very specific challenges, and we really need to be able to address those by developing new approaches to Vivax, new drugs, a vaccine for Vivax. Those things seem to be a long way off at present. And we also have this issue which we'll be hearing more about drug resistance, so that there have been commitments to eliminate malaria from the falciparum malaria, I should say, from the Mekong countries, which is where the high levels of artemisinin resistance have developed, and also resistance to the partner drugs it's used with by 2020. So there are pluses and minuses. I think a final point is that a lot of the people in some of these countries who are most at risk of malaria are minorities who are in quite remote areas, people sometimes dealing in illegal activities, logging, mining, and moving across borders. So engaging those populations which will otherwise be reservoirs of disease is another important component of any strategy. And we know that from the press recently that those kind of minorities may not be very popular with their local governments. So we need a few things for malaria elimination. Obviously political will, and that is going to be very hard to maintain. As malaria disappears off the radar, people forget about it as a problem, and they may forget that they need to not just hope that having gone down it will stay away, but to maintain the efforts to eradicate every last case. That is going to be a challenge for us. We also really need to have a lot of cooperation in the region. I think organisations such as the Asia-Pacific Leaders Malaria Alliance and an organisation called APMEN, which my slides seem to have disappeared, which is the Australian Pacific Malaria Elimination Network, has been a terrific forum that some of the people in this session have been working with as a way of bringing together researchers from across the region, indulging in knowledge sharing, capacity building, networking, developing common strategies, bringing people from national malaria control programs together to talk about how to deal with joint and important issues related to malaria policy. Archie's going to talk, and some of the other speakers will be talking about community engagement. And I think getting the local communities to be on board with any malaria control activities is extremely important. And apart from funding, we do need improved tools. Most people believe we can't eliminate malaria globally without vaccines, and the current vaccine we have is not adequately efficacious to allow us to do that. We also will need additional drugs, especially for Vivax malaria, I think. So what can we achieve? This is a possibly optimistic view of what we might be able to do over the next 15 years, suggesting that by 2030, malaria transmission may be completely ceased in the Asia-Pacific region, and that the countries will either be malaria-free for over 3 years, that is, have undergone elimination, or will have interrupted transmission. And this is our ultimate goal by 2050. Here's hoping we get to see it. I just want to thank my funders, and particularly thank Professor Rick Price from Darwin, who was supposed to be talking in this session, wasn't able to come, and gave me quite a few of the slides I presented today. And thanks for your attention.